The room was dim, the air smelling faintly of antiseptic and something metallic. I lay on a bed, feeling fuzzy, like my brain was packed in cotton. A figure stood over me, his face obscured by the low light, but I could tell he wore a doctor's coat. His voice, when he spoke, was low, almost a whisper, yet it cut through the fog in my head with a chilling clarity. "Wear this dress," he said, and I watched as he gestured to a hanger by the wall. On it hung a dress, shimmering, ornate, completely out of place in what I thought was a recovery room. It was made of a dark, heavy fabric, with intricate beadwork that caught the scarce light. My mind, still sluggish, tried to make sense of it. A doctor? Ordering me to wear a dress? It felt absurd, a wrong note in a quiet symphony. His eyes, though, were not a doctor's eyes. They held a different kind of authority, a cold, unyielding command that had nothing to do with healing. There was no medical concern in his tone, only an unnerving finality. This wasn't a request, it was an order. The realization hit me, a cold splash of water in my groggy state. This wasn't a doctor, and this wasn't a hospital procedure. Despite the raw shock and a fear that began to prickle at the edges of my awareness, my mind processed his command with a strange, almost detached clarity. The emotional violence of the situation was immense, yet my immediate response was an internal assessment. I was calculating. What was my predicament? What did this mean? I noted the subtle shift in his demeanor, the way his gaze lingered not on a chart, but on me, as if I were an object to be commanded, not a patient to be cared for. It was a look of possession, of ownership, that sent a shiver down my spine. A brief flicker of a future consequence crossed my mind, a shadow of the elaborate deception that must have led me here. How had I ended up in this trap? How had a moment of desperate vulnerability, seeking help, led to something far more sinister than any medical emergency? The injustice of it all, the profound wrongness, settled heavy in my gut. He thought he had me. He thought he could command me, control me, use me. But he had no idea. He had no idea the monumental price he would pay for this monstrous manipulation. He had no idea that the silk of that dress would eventually become the very fabric of his undoing. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. My name is Elena. I grew up in a small village tucked away in the rolling hills of a Mediterranean country. It was a place where the past felt very present, where old traditions shaped our days. But we also looked towards new ideas. My childhood was simple, filled with the warmth of a close-knit community. Everyone knew everyone, and helping your neighbor wasn't just a suggestion, it was how life worked. I learned a lot from my family. My grandmother, with her hands always busy, taught me about being tough, about getting through hard times with a quiet strength. She had seen a lot in her life, and she always found a way to keep going. My mother taught me kindness, how a small gesture could make a big difference, and how important it was to listen to people. Really listen. And my father, a fisherman, taught me honesty. His life was tied to the sea, unpredictable and powerful, and he always said that the sea didn't care for lies. You had to be honest with it, and honest with yourself, to survive. He worked hard, day in and day out, and that work ethic was something he passed down to me. The village itself was a vibrant place. We had lively festivals that brought everyone together, music echoing through the narrow streets, and the smell of delicious food cooking in every home. Meals were always shared, big tables overflowing with laughter and conversation. There was an unwavering support system there, a sense that we were all in it together. This place, these people, shaped how I saw the world. I believed that most people were good at heart. I believed in the power of understanding others, of putting yourself in their shoes, and I truly believed that trust, once given, was a sacred thing. These were the core ideas that built me, the bedrock of who I was. Later, these very beliefs would crash hard against a very different, very cold world, a world that didn't care for empathy or trust. From a young age, I dreamed of becoming a healer. It wasn't a sudden idea. It grew slowly, like a plant in the rich soil of my village. I was inspired by the village elder, an old woman with wise eyes and gentle hands. She wasn't a doctor in the modern sense, but she knew all the plants, all the old remedies. She'd soothe fevers with herbal teas and mend sprains with poultices, always with comforting words that felt as important as the medicine itself. I watched her, fascinated by her ability to ease pain and bring peace. I wanted to be like her, to help people, to make them feel better. This desire to heal, to offer comfort and care, was a strong current running through my life. It was this very dream, this pure and simple wish to help others, that would tragically become the path that changed my life forever, twisting it in ways I could never have imagined. It led me directly to the man in the doctor's coat, the one with the cold eyes and the impossible command. My life now was a world away from that quiet village. I worked as a nurse in a big, busy city hospital. The days blurred into one another, a constant rush of patient care, long shifts that stretched into the night, and the steady, low hum of medical machines filling the air. It was demanding work, but I found a purpose in it, a way to fulfill that childhood dream of helping others, even if it wasn't with herbal remedies. My interactions with the other nurses and doctors were mostly professional. I had good friends among my colleagues, people who understood the pressure and shared the small victories. We'd grab coffee together, complain about the endless paperwork, and celebrate when a difficult patient finally went home. I lived in a modest apartment, just big enough for me. After a long shift, I'd find comfort in cooking traditional meals, the smells reminding me of home. I even managed to keep a small balcony garden, a few pots of herbs and some bright flowers, a tiny patch of green in the concrete jungle. My life was steady, built on quiet dedication and a simple, honest routine. There was nothing flashy about it, just hard work and a desire to do good. It was into this ordinary, hard-working life that Dr. Alistair Thorne first entered. He was a renowned surgeon, known throughout the hospital, and really the city. He had a certain charm, a way of carrying himself that commanded attention. Everyone respected him, and his reputation for skill was undeniable. He was a figure of authority, someone you looked up to. But even early on, something felt a little off to me. It wasn't anything obvious, just small things I noticed. Sometimes, when he spoke to the junior staff, his tone would be a bit dismissive, a quick word, or a raised eyebrow that made them shrink. I saw a certain coldness in his eyes too, especially when a patient was being particularly difficult or emotional. It was like he saw them as a problem to be solved, not a person to be cared for. He also had this possessiveness over his cases. He didn't just manage them, he seemed to own them, sometimes bordering on arrogance. He'd insist on doing things his way, even when other doctors suggested alternatives. These weren't big, glaring red flags. They were just faint, unsettling notes in what otherwise seemed like a perfectly harmonious professional environment. Most people probably didn't even notice. They were too caught up in his charm or his reputation. But I did. With my innate sensitivity, the one that made me listen closely and observe carefully, I picked up on these almost imperceptible cues. They stirred a quiet sense of unease inside me, a tiny whisper that something wasn't quite right. I couldn't put my finger on it, and I pushed it down, telling myself it was just the stress of the job, or maybe I was overthinking things. Still, the feeling lingered, a subtle shadow in the bright, busy halls of the hospital. It was the first sign that this man, this respected surgeon, was not what he seemed, and that my quiet life was about to become anything but ordinary. It was the beginning of the end of the peace I had found. The initial tensions between me and Dr. Thorne didn't explode into big arguments. Instead, They showed up in the small, everyday professional interactions. I always focused on the patient, making sure they felt heard and understood, trying to see the whole person, not just their illness. Thorne, on the other hand, was all about results, about getting the job done efficiently. He seemed to view patients as a series of medical problems to be fixed, not as individuals with fears and feelings. This difference in approach often put us at odds, though never in a loud, dramatic way. There would be minor disagreements during rounds or when discussing a patient's care plan. I'd suggest something that seemed more comforting or holistic for the patient, like spending a little extra time explaining a procedure or ensuring they had emotional support. Thorne, however, would often cut me off or give a dismissive wave of his hand. He'd emphasize the need for speed, for moving on to the next case, for sticking strictly to the clinical protocol. His priority was always the outcome, the successful surgery, the quick recovery, the numbers. My priority was the person going through it all. He often dismissed my suggestions with a condescending smile, a slight tilt of his head that screamed, "You don't know what you're talking about." Or he'd give a curt remark, something like, "Nurse Elena, we don't have time for poetry here." Or, "Let's stick to the facts, shall we?" It wasn't overtly mean, but it was enough to subtly undermine my professional confidence. It made me second-guess myself, even when I knew my instincts were right. He seemed to see my empathy, my careful consideration for patients' emotional well-being, as a weakness, a distraction from the real work. He interpreted my thoroughness and patient-first approach as inefficiency, as a waste of precious time. I remember one specific instance. A patient was particularly anxious about an upcoming surgery, asking a lot of questions, needing a lot of reassurance. I spent extra time with her, explaining things in simple terms, trying to calm her fears. Thorne walked in, saw me talking to her, and after the patient had left, he pulled me aside. He didn't yell, but his voice was cold. "Nurse Elena," he said, "your job is to prepare the patient, not to become their therapist. We have a schedule to maintain." He made it sound like I was being unprofessional, even though I was doing what I believed was best for the patient. Being someone who always strived for harmony, I internalized these frustrations. I told myself that he was just under a lot of pressure, that his demanding profession made him act that way. I tried to find logical explanations for his occasional coldness, his dismissive attitude. I clung to the belief that his brilliance as a surgeon outweighed his interpersonal shortcomings. After all, he saved lives, didn't he? He was a genius in his field. Surely that made up for a little lack of bedside manner. I told myself that he was, at heart, a good doctor, just a difficult person. I wanted to believe that, I really did. It was easier to make excuses for him than to confront the unsettling feeling that grew inside me. These early interactions, though seemingly minor, were actually laying the groundwork for a growing imbalance of power and respect. They were chipping away at my confidence, making me question my own judgment. They were conditioning me to accept his authority, even when my gut told me something was wrong. It was a slow, insidious process, and I didn't even realize how deeply it was affecting me until much later. The quiet unease was slowly turning into a dull ache, a constant companion in my daily hospital routine. The quiet unease I felt around Thorne was about to deepen, turning into something far more unsettling. Looking back, I could recall so many instances where Thorne's past behaviors had chipped away at my trust, creating deeper emotional cracks long before the current crisis. It wasn't just about his dismissive attitude in the operating room or his sharp remarks. It was also about the subtle ways he manipulated situations to his advantage, often at the expense of others, and not always in a way that was immediately obvious. There were promises made to patients that were not fully kept, not out of malice, I thought at the time, but out of a casual disregard for their emotional well-being once the medical procedure was complete. I remember one elderly woman, Mrs. Petrova, who was promised follow-up calls and detailed rehabilitation plans. Thorne performed a successful surgery, but once she was discharged, his interest vanished. He'd delegate the follow-up to junior staff, or sometimes it would just fall through the cracks entirely. When I'd bring it up, he'd simply shrug, saying, "The surgery was successful, wasn't it? What more do they want?" He showed a clear disinterest in any follow-up care that didn't directly benefit his reputation or add to his impressive surgical statistics. I also remembered moments of subtle disrespect towards me and other female staff. He'd disguise it as professional banter, but it always left a lingering sting. He would interrupt me mid-sentence during ward rounds, not because what I was saying was wrong, but almost as if to assert his dominance. He'd take credit for my insights, presenting them as his own ideas during team meetings, or make light of my concerns in front of others, turning them into jokes. "Oh, Elena's worried about the patient's spiritual well-being again," he'd say with a smirk, getting a few chuckles from the male doctors. It made me feel small, unheard, and undervalued. These incidents, small on their own, accumulated over time. They slowly eroded my initial trust in him. That trust was replaced by a quiet wariness, a constant feeling that I needed to be on guard. I began to see not just a brilliant surgeon, but a man who prioritized his own agenda above genuine care and respect for others. He was a master of appearances, able to charm patients and senior colleagues, while behind the scenes, he operated with a chilling self-interest. This slow, insidious chipping away at my faith in him forms the emotional bedrock of the tragedy that was to come. I started to notice how he would subtly shift blame, how he would avoid responsibility for minor errors, always finding a way to make it someone else's problem. He was incredibly skilled at deflecting, at making others feel like they were the ones who had misunderstood or underperformed. My gut feelings, which I had initially dismissed as oversensitivity, grew stronger. I realized that his occasional coldness wasn't just a byproduct of his demanding job. It was a core part of his character. He lacked genuine empathy, seeing people as means to an end, whether that end was a successful surgery for his record or simply avoiding personal inconvenience. The emotional cracks were there, deep and wide, long before I ever put on that dress. There was a critical medical conference, I remember it vividly. It was early in my career, and I was so proud to present a case study I'd worked on for months. It was about a rare post-surgical infection, and my research highlighted some key preventative measures. Thorne was in the audience, a senior resident at the time, already building his reputation. When it came time for questions, he stood up. Instead of offering constructive feedback, he publicly critiqued my work with an unnecessarily harsh tone, tearing apart my methodology and questioning my conclusions. He made me feel small and humiliated in front of my peers and superiors. Even though my findings were valid and later proven correct, his words hung over me, making me doubt myself. He had a way of cutting you down that felt surgical, precise, and deeply personal, even when he claimed it was all about the science. Another instance, even more insidious, involved a complex patient case. A young man, barely out of his teens, had a difficult recovery after a procedure Thorne performed. There was a minor procedural error, a tiny miscalculation that prolonged the patient's hospital stay and caused him unnecessary discomfort. Thorne, instead of owning it, subtly manipulated me into taking the blame. He called me into his office, looking concerned. He said something like, "Elena, I know you were assisting on that case. Perhaps you missed a step in the post-op protocol, which led to this complication. It's a learning opportunity for you." He presented it as mentorship, as a way for me to grow, while skillfully deflecting any scrutiny from himself. I, naive and eager to please, accepted it, internalizing the guilt. It wasn't until much later, replaying the events in my mind, that I realized how expertly he had shifted the blame. He always had an excuse, always a way to frame things so he came out looking good, even if it meant sacrificing someone else's reputation. Then there were the times, too many to count, when I was overwhelmed. A difficult patient, a chaotic night shift, a sudden emergency that stretched our resources thin. Thorne, despite being senior and present, would conspicuously distance himself. He'd disappear into his office or claim an urgent consultation, leaving me and the other junior staff to shoulder the burden alone. It wasn't just physical abandonment, it was a silent abandonment of his leadership responsibilities. A clear message that my struggles were my own, not his concern. He was always there for the glory, never for the grind. He'd swoop in for the critical moment, take charge, and then vanish once the messy aftermath began, leaving us to pick up the pieces. These experiences, coupled with my upbringing, explain why I tolerated so much. I was raised to respect authority, to avoid conflict, and to believe that professional dedication would eventually be recognized. My grandmother always said, "The quiet river runs deep." I took that to mean patience and perseverance would eventually win out. I saw these incidents as isolated flaws in an otherwise brilliant man. I told myself he was under immense pressure, that his genius simply came with a difficult personality. I clung to the belief that beneath the arrogance, there was a good doctor, a man dedicated to healing. I believed that if I just worked harder, was more diligent, he would eventually see my worth, that my quiet commitment would somehow earn his respect. It was a foolish hope, born from a lifetime of trying to find the good in people, even when they made it incredibly hard. I was conditioned to strive for harmony, to give people the benefit of the doubt, and to believe that professional dedication would eventually be recognized. I convinced myself that these were just minor bumps in the road, not signs of a deeply flawed character. The quiet wariness Elena developed over time, a slow erosion of her trust, soon escalated into outright conflict. Thorne's behavior became increasingly abusive and arrogant, especially after a significant promotion within the hospital. This new position, granting him even more power and influence, seemed to inflate his already considerable ego to an unbearable degree. His interactions with Elena, and indeed with most of the junior staff, shifted from subtle dismissals to open disdain. He began to openly disregard Elena's input, making snap decisions about patient care that completely bypassed her professional judgment. These decisions often felt rushed, driven by his need for efficiency rather than genuine patient well-being, and he made them without any consultation, treating her as little more than a pair of hands. His negligence became more pronounced, manifesting in cutting corners during procedures, pushing for early discharges that were medically questionable, and delegating increasingly critical tasks to inexperienced staff members. All the while, he maintained a facade of absolute control, presenting himself as the ultimate authority, even when his choices bordered on recklessness. Elena, with her deep-seated ethical compass, felt a growing obligation to resist. She tried to raise her concerns gently, always framing them as questions or suggestions, hoping to appeal to any remaining professional integrity he might possess. She started documenting discrepancies, making meticulous notes of his questionable directives and their potential impact on patients. She advocated tirelessly for her patients, often staying late to ensure their needs were met, even when Thorne's protocols made it difficult. However, each attempt to push back was met with his icy dismissal. He would look at her with eyes that seemed to freeze over, delivering thinly veiled threats about her career, reminding her of his power and her expendability. He might say something like, "Nurse, your opinions are noted, but my decisions are final. If you find that difficult to accept, perhaps this isn't the right environment for you." The emotional weight on Elena became immense. She felt trapped, caught between her unwavering professional ethics and the powerful, unyielding authority of Thorn. Her conscience screamed at her to do more, but the fear of retaliation, of losing the career she had worked so hard for, held her back. It was a suffocating feeling, like being held underwater, struggling to breathe. The once subtle tensions now manifested as overt power plays, with Thorn deliberately asserting his dominance in every interaction. He would publicly contradict her, assign her the most undesirable shifts, or simply ignore her presence, making her feel invisible and powerless. Elena felt a growing sense of helplessness. She watched the quality of care subtly decline under his increasingly reckless leadership, a direct consequence of his arrogance and negligence. Her own voice, once a quiet but consistent advocate for her patients, was systematically silenced. The hospital, once a place of purpose and healing, was becoming a source of profound moral distress. Every day felt like a battle she was losing, a quiet erosion of her values and her spirit. She was witnessing a brilliant mind descend into a dangerous egomania, and she was powerless to stop it, forced to stand by as his unchecked ambition began to endanger the very lives they were sworn to protect. The system, it seemed, was designed to protect him, not the patients, and certainly not her. The emotional environment Elena found herself in was suffocating. The hospital, once a beacon of healing and hope, now felt like a cage, its sterile walls closing in on her. The pressure wasn't just coming from Thorn directly. It was also from the systemic silence that surrounded his increasingly erratic and dangerous behavior. Nobody spoke up. Everyone seemed to look away, pretending not to see the obvious decline in patient care, the casual disregard for protocols, or the chilling arrogance that now defined Thorn's every move. This collective silence was almost as damaging as Thorn himself, creating an atmosphere where injustice festered unchecked. Outside the hospital, Elena faced a different kind of pressure, subtle but equally potent. Her family, who had always been so proud of her career, unknowingly added to her burden. When she tried to hint at her struggles, they encouraged her to make the best of it, to be patient, or to avoid trouble. These were common cultural sentiments, deeply ingrained in their upbringing, emphasizing harmony and avoiding conflict, especially with those in positions of authority. To challenge someone as esteemed as Dr. Thorn, a man with such a powerful reputation, felt almost sacrilegious to them. There was a societal expectation to maintain appearances, to not rock the boat, to quietly endure rather than openly confront. This made it incredibly difficult for Elena to confide fully in them, leaving her feeling even more isolated. Her colleagues, too, contributed to this hostile social climate. Many were genuinely fearful of Thorn, knowing his capacity for retaliation. Others, perhaps, were convinced of his untouchable status, believing that challenging him was futile. A few, she suspected, subtly aligned themselves with him, hoping to gain favor or avoid becoming his next target. This meant that whenever Elena voiced a concern, however cautiously, it was often met with discomfort, a quick change of subject, or even thinly veiled accusations of oversensitivity or professional jealousy. She felt like an outcast, her valid concerns dismissed as personal failings rather than legitimate issues. This isolation deepened her sense of helplessness, making her question her own judgment at times, even when her conscience screamed otherwise. The cultural emphasis on harmony and avoiding public confrontation weighed heavily on her. Elena felt a profound sense of shame in even considering challenging Thorn openly. It wasn't just about fear of retaliation, though that was very real. It was also the fear of losing her job and, perhaps most significantly, the fear of bringing dishonor to her family. In her culture, public disputes, especially those involving authority figures, were seen as deeply embarrassing, reflecting poorly not just on the individual, but on their entire family. This cultural conditioning, combined with the real threat of professional ruin, created an insurmountable barrier, She felt trapped, unable to voice the escalating injustice without risking everything she had worked for and everything her family held dear. The silence was deafening, and the path forward seemed utterly blocked, leaving her in a constant state of internal turmoil. Every day was a struggle to maintain her composure, to put on a brave face, while inside, the pressure mounted, threatening to explode. Elena reached her psychological limit. The constant emotional burden of Thorne's abuse, the fear of losing her career, and the systemic gaslighting had worn her down to a fragile state. She felt like a tightly wound spring, vibrating with an unbearable tension that threatened to snap at any moment. Every morning was a battle to drag herself out of bed. The thought of facing another day under Thorne's thumb, an exhausting weight on her chest. Small details started to reveal her nearing collapse. Sleepless nights became the norm, her mind replaying every condescending remark, every dismissed concern, every instance of Thorne's casual cruelty. She would stare at the ceiling for hours, the hospital's sterile smell clinging to her, even in her small apartment. Her appetite vanished, food tasted like ash, and she often forgot to eat, her body growing thinner, her clothes hanging loosely. A pervasive sense of dread had settled over her, a cold, heavy cloud that followed her everywhere. The simple joys she once cherished, like tending to her small balcony garden or cooking a traditional meal, now felt impossible, her energy completely drained. Her once bright eyes, known for their warmth and empathy, were now shadowed with exhaustion, worry, and a deep, unshakable sadness. The spark that made Elena, was dimming, almost extinguished. Her focus, once her greatest asset as a nurse, began to waver. She started making uncharacteristic mistakes at work, small at first, but enough to cause a tremor of fear in her. A forgotten detail on a patient's chart, a moment of hesitation during a critical procedure, a misheard instruction. These were not just errors. They were symptoms, clear signs of a mind pushed to its absolute breaking point, a spirit on the verge of shattering. Her colleagues, even those who had previously been dismissive, started to notice. They saw the dark circles under her eyes, the way she flinched at sudden noises, the quiet tremor in her hands. Some offered concerned glances, others avoided eye contact, perhaps uncomfortable with the raw vulnerability radiating from her. The internal battle was relentless. Her conscience screamed at her to act, to expose Thorne, but the fear of the consequences, the cultural pressures, and the sheer exhaustion held her captive. She felt like she was drowning, submerged under an invisible weight, unable to surface for air. The quiet, resilient Elena, the woman who had always found strength in adversity, was on the verge of shattering. The pressure had built up too much, too long. Something, anything, had to give. The rupture was not just approaching. It was imminent, a ticking time bomb inside her, waiting for the slightest trigger to explode and change everything. Her body ached, her mind raced, and her spirit was frayed to its thinnest thread. She knew, deep down, that she couldn't continue like this. The path she was on was unsustainable, leading only to complete breakdown. She needed a way out, a catalyst, something to break the suffocating cycle before it broke her completely. The silence, the fear, the constant emotional assault, it all had to end. The story reached its most decisive moment, a cruel, ironic twist that would forever alter Elena's trajectory. One morning, a sharp, searing pain tore through her abdomen, doubling her over. It came out of nowhere, a sudden, incapacitating agony that left her gasping for breath. Her flatmate, alarmed by her cries, called an ambulance, and Elena found herself being rushed to the very hospital where she worked, her vision blurring, the familiar corridors now a tunnel of pain and fear. The irony was almost unbearable. Here she was, a nurse dedicated to healing, now a patient in desperate need of it. As fate, or perhaps a more sinister force, would have it, Dr. Thorne was the attending physician on call that day. Elena, drifting in and out of consciousness, vaguely registered his voice, his imposing presence. She was prepped for an emergency procedure, her body racked with pain, her mind too foggy to fully process the nightmare unfolding around her. The bright lights of the operating room, the hushed voices, the cold touch of sterile instruments. It was all a blur of discomfort and fear. While semi-conscious, still feeling the lingering effects of anesthesia and the heavy fog of pain medication, Elena overheard Thorne discussing her condition with a colleague. His voice, usually so precise and controlled, was now tinged with a casual indifference that sent a shiver down her spine, even in her dazed state. "It's a minor complication from her previous appendectomy," he said, his words cutting through the haze. "Nothing too serious, but it's certainly compounding her current symptoms." The words hit Elena like a physical blow, awakening her more effectively than any stimulant. A previous appendectomy. She had never had an appendectomy. Then a sickening realization dawned on her. Months ago, she had undergone a minor elective procedure for a benign cyst performed by none other than Thorne himself. He had assured her it was routine, straightforward, with no complications. Now, he was casually admitting to a minor complication from that surgery, a complication he had deliberately concealed, and one that was now exacerbating her current life-threatening illness. He spoke of it with a chilling lack of remorse, almost as an inconvenience to his schedule, a mere footnote in his busy day. This revelation was a devastating emotional explosion for Elena. The realization that he had not only harmed her, but actively hidden it, and now spoke of her life-threatening condition with such callousness, shattered her last vestiges of composure. It was a betrayal of the highest order, confirming his monstrous nature beyond any doubt. The quiet, insidious unease she had felt about him, the subtle disrespect, the manipulative tendencies, it all coalesced into one undeniable truth. He was a danger, a predator cloaked in a doctor's white coat. In that moment, a profound shift occurred within Elena. The fear and resignation that had plagued her for so long vanished, replaced by a cold, burning resolve. The pain in her body was immense, but the pain of this betrayal was far greater, sharpening her focus, clearing the fog from her mind. She decided then and there that she would expose him, no matter the cost. Everything changed from this point forward. Her fight for survival transformed into a fight for justice. The quiet, resilient nurse who had tolerated so much was gone, replaced by a woman fueled by righteous anger and an unshakable determination. She would not just heal, she would make sure Thorne paid for his deceit. The immediate aftermath of Thorne's betrayal and Elena's newfound resolve was a strange, charged silence. Physically, she was still recovering, the pain from her illness a constant, dull throb. But internally, a transformation had taken place. The fear that had been her constant companion for months had receded, replaced by a cold, steady flame of purpose. She lay in her hospital bed, the sterile white sheets a stark contrast to the tumultuous landscape of her mind, and began to subtly gather her thoughts, piecing together fragments of memory, incidents, and conversations. Every interaction with Thorne, every offhand comment, every dismissive gesture, now took on a sinister new meaning. Her family, initially relieved by her survival, soon noticed a subtle but profound change in her. Her mother, ever perceptive, saw the steely glint in Elena's eyes, a quiet assertiveness that replaced her usual deference. Her father, usually jovial, sensed a new gravity in her silence. They asked if she was okay, if she needed anything, but Elena merely offered reassuring smiles, deflecting their concerns. She knew they wouldn't understand, not yet. This was her battle, and she had to fight it on her own terms. Friends and colleagues visiting her in the hospital also picked up on the shift. The once empathetic, slightly reserved Elena now seemed to possess an inner core of unyielding strength. Her conversations were shorter, more focused. She listened intently, but her responses were measured, almost strategic. Some wondered if the illness had changed her, if the brush with death had given her a new perspective. They were right, in a way. It had given her a new directive. Thorn, utterly oblivious to the seismic shift within Elena, continued his arrogant charade. He visited her room a few times, a picture of feigned concern, his voice dripping with professional sympathy. "So glad you're recovering, Nurse Elena," he'd say, a hand resting lightly on her arm, a gesture she now found repulsive. "It was a tricky case, but we pulled you through." He might even make a veiled attempt to ensure her silence, a casual remark about discretion, about maintaining a professional front, about how important it was for everyone's reputation that this minor complication remained just that, minor and forgotten. Each word, each patronizing glance only solidified Elena's conviction, pouring more fuel onto the fire of her resolve. He had no idea he was digging his own grave with every breath. Elena grappled with a tumultuous mix of emotions. There was the profound physical pain from the betrayal, the lingering aches from her illness, but also a cold rage at Thorn's deceit. It was a terrifying yet empowering sense of purpose. The fear was still present, a faint echo in the back of her mind, the logical part of her whispering about the risks, the potential ruin of her career, the power Thorn wielded. But it was now overshadowed, dwarfed even, by a powerful, almost primal need for justice. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every patient he had harmed, every lie he had told, every life he had casually endangered for his own gain. She would be their voice. She would be the reckoning. Physically recovering, Elena retreated inward, confronting the profound isolation that came with her new mission. The hospital room, once a place of vulnerability, became a sanctuary for her silent planning. She spent hours staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction with Thorn, every subtle hint she had missed, every warning sign she had ignored. The anguish of knowing Thorn's true nature, coupled with the immense personal risk of exposing him, created intense internal conflict. She grappled with the potential loss of her career, her reputation, and the societal backlash she might face. What would her family say? How would her community, so ingrained with respect for authority, react to her challenging such a powerful figure? The question swirled, heavy and relentless. She knew that taking on Thorn meant more than just presenting facts. It meant tearing down a carefully constructed facade that the entire medical establishment had, in some way, endorsed. It meant challenging a system that often protected its own, especially those as celebrated as Thorn. The thought was daunting, almost paralyzing at times. There were moments, late at night when the hospital was quiet, when fear would creep in, whispering doubts, urging her to just let it go, to rebuild her life quietly and forget the nightmare. But then she would remember the casual cruelty in Thorn's voice as he discussed her minor complication, the chilling indifference to her suffering, and the resolve would harden once more. Some secondary characters, once supportive, began to distance themselves. Her friend Maria, a fellow nurse who had often commiserated with Elena about Thorn's behavior, grew quiet and evasive when Elena tried to discuss her plans. Maria's eyes held a mixture of fear and pity. "Elena, be careful," she had whispered, looking over her shoulder. "He's very powerful." Another colleague, a young doctor who had once admired Elena's dedication, started avoiding her gaze in the hallway, fearing association with someone who dared to challenge the hierarchy. Either out of fear of Thorn's influence or an inability to comprehend the depth of Elena's resolve, They pulled away, leaving her feeling even more alone. Others, a rare few, showed quiet, unwavering support. A kindly elderly cleaner who had worked at the hospital for decades and seen countless doctors come and go would offer Elena a warm smile and a knowing nod. "Truth always comes out, dear," she'd say, almost prophetically. Dr. Ramirez, a quiet, principled physician who had always treated Elena with respect, sent her a small anonymous package containing an old medical journal article detailing a similar case of medical negligence that had gone unpunished. These small gestures became her silent anchors, tiny rays of light in the growing darkness of her isolation. The cultural and societal pressures to forgive and forget, to maintain the status quo, made Elena's path even more solitary. Her mother, during a hesitant phone call, urged caution. "You have a good job, Elena. Don't make trouble. It's not worth it." This emphasis on harmony and avoiding public confrontation meant Elena felt a profound sense of shame in even considering challenging Thorne. She was expected to endure, to move on, to not bring dishonor by publicizing a conflict. She had to navigate her pain and her purpose, largely in silence, carefully planning her next moves while the world around her urged caution. It was a lonely road, paved with doubt and fear, but lit by the fierce glow of her unwavering need for justice. She knew that to truly dismantle Thorne, she needed to be meticulous, patient, and utterly invisible in her preparations. The real battle was just beginning, and she was preparing to fight it on her own. Elena began the arduous process of rebuilding, not just her health, but her life and her strategy. There was no magical transformation, no sudden burst of energy that erased the lingering fatigue or the ache of betrayal. Instead, it was a slow, deliberate reconstruction, a brick-by-brick effort to reclaim what Thorne had tried to destroy. Her physical recovery was paramount. She followed every instruction from her doctors, pushing herself gently through physical therapy, focusing on each breath, each movement as a small victory. The hospital, once a place of dread, slowly became a place of healing again, albeit one she viewed with newfound skepticism. Her reconstruction involved meticulous research. She spent hours in the hospital library, poring over medical journals, cross-referencing cases, and familiarizing herself with the intricate legal precedents surrounding medical malpractice. She learned about patient rights, ethics committees, and the often frustrating labyrinth of bureaucratic procedures. Quietly, almost invisibly, she began to gather evidence. This wasn't about dramatic confrontations, but about cold, hard facts. She started making copies of her own medical records, cross-referencing dates, and noting inconsistencies. She discreetly reached out to former colleagues, framing her questions carefully, fishing for information without revealing her ultimate intent. It was a painstaking process, filled with small victories and disheartening setbacks. There were moments of genuine progress, like when an old nurse, now retired, remembered a particular incident involving Thorne that corroborated Elena's suspicions. Or when she found a loophole in the hospital's internal reporting system that allowed her to access old patient files without raising immediate alarms. These were small wins, but they fueled her resolve. Yet, there were also significant setbacks. A lawyer she consulted, initially sympathetic, became evasive when he realized the power and influence Thorne wielded. He politely declined to take her case, citing conflicts of interest. Such moments brought waves of doubt, making the enormity of her task threaten to overwhelm her. The fear of failure, of being dismissed as a disgruntled employee, was a constant companion. Through it all, Elena was learning and growing in ways she never imagined. She learned to navigate the complex legal and bureaucratic systems, deciphering jargon and understanding the subtle power dynamics at play. She discovered an inner strength and resilience she never knew she possessed. The quiet, empathetic nurse was still there, but now she was underpinned by a steely determination. She learned to trust her instincts, to be patient, understanding that true justice was a marathon, not a sprint. She meticulously planned her every move, thinking several steps ahead, anticipating Thorne's reactions, and building her case with the precision of a surgeon. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, life began to reclaim its small joys. A shared meal with her trusted friend, Dr. Ramirez, who, despite the risks, continued to offer veiled support and encouragement. A moment of peace tending to her small balcony garden, watching the vibrant flowers bloom. A quiet symbol of resilience and growth. These small moments were crucial anchors in her difficult journey, reminding her of what she was fighting for, not just for herself, but for the principle of integrity, for the sanctity of trust, and for the countless patients who deserved honest care. These quiet pockets of normalcy provided the strength to continue, to push through the fear, and to prepare for the inevitable confrontation. She was ready. The carefully constructed plan Elena had been building, piece by meticulous piece, now began to take effect. It wasn't a sudden explosion, but a slow, almost imperceptible unraveling of Thorne's carefully cultivated image. Whispers started to circulate, hushed conversations in hospital corridors, glances exchanged when his name came up. Initially, they were just rumors, easily dismissed as professional jealousy. But Elena had planted seeds of doubt with precision, and now they were beginning to sprout. A formal inquiry was discreetly initiated by the hospital board, spurred by an anonymous complaint detailing several inconsistencies in patient care and billing, all backed by the subtle evidence Elena had compiled. Thorne, always so confident, found himself facing questions he couldn't charm his way out of. He tried to dismiss them, to deflect, but the detailed nature of the allegations, the dates, the specific patient files, made it impossible. He started to lose control over his narrative. The easy explanations he once offered, the casual dismissals, no longer worked. More evidence of his negligence and deceit began to surface, not just concerning Elena, but other past patients whose complaints had previously been buried or ignored. Elena had carefully structured her information to embolden others, to show them they weren't alone. His professional status, once unassailable, began its slow, agonizing erosion. Referrals, once a steady stream, dwindled to a trickle. Invitations to prestigious medical conferences, where he once held court, ceased to arrive. Even within the hospital, his inner circle began to shrink. His once loyal staff, those who had admired or feared him, started to look at him with suspicion, a subtle shift in their eyes that Thorne, for all his arrogance, couldn't ignore. The public, initially unaware of the internal turmoil, started to question the integrity of the celebrated surgeon as news of the inquiry, however vague, began to leak to local media. This was a realistic kind of justice, not the dramatic, cinematic kind. There was no immediate arrest, no sudden downfall in front of flashing cameras. Instead, it was a slow, agonizing process. The loss of his reputation, meticulously built over decades, was a far more potent and lasting form of punishment than any prison sentence could offer. His professional standing, the very foundation of his identity, crumbled day by day. He saw the respect he craved replaced by scorn, the admiration by quiet contempt. His world, built on lies and manipulation, was shattering. He might still walk free, but he was losing everything that truly mattered to him: his power, his prestige, and his control. The silk of that dress truly was becoming the fabric of his undoing. The formal inquiry concluded with a verdict that echoed through the medical community. Dr. Alistair Thorne, once a celebrated surgeon, was stripped of his medical license. The charges were numerous: professional misconduct, negligence, and the deliberate concealment of medical complications. His career, the very core of his identity, was irrevocably destroyed. He became a pariah, a shadow of his former self, consumed by the hubris that had initially propelled him to such heights. The respect he had demanded was now replaced by universal disdain, his name synonymous with deceit rather than brilliance. Elena, watching from a distance, felt a complex mix of emotions. There was no triumphant glee, only a quiet, profound sense of closure. She reflected intimately on her journey, the path that had twisted from a humble village nurse to the unexpected architect of a powerful man's downfall. The scars were undeniable, deep and raw. The experience had left an indelible mark on her soul, a constant reminder of the fragility of trust and the insidious nature of power. Yet, alongside the scars, an incredible strength had been forged within her. She was no longer the naive nurse who had once tolerated dismissive remarks, but a woman tempered by fire, deeply aware of her own worth and the power of truth. She connected her origins to this moment, seeing the unbroken thread that ran through her life, her grandmother's resilience, her mother's kindness, her father's honesty. These values, instilled in her from a young age, had been tested to their absolute limit. Her desire to be a healer, a path she had chosen out of a genuine wish to help others, had tragically become the arena where she fought her greatest battle. The suffering she endured, the isolation, the fear, all had led her to this point of profound self-discovery. She understood that her pursuit of justice was not just for herself, but for all those silenced by power, for every patient whose trust had been betrayed, for every voice that had been dismissed. She had carried the burden of their silent suffering, and in bringing Thorn to account, she had given them a voice. The ending was human and heavy. Elena found peace, not in revenge, but in the restoration of integrity. She knew she might never fully heal from the trauma. The memory of Thorn's cold eyes, the casual cruelty of his deception, would always linger. But she had reclaimed her narrative, her dignity, and her belief in justice. She had walked through the fire and emerged, not unscathed, but unbroken. Months later, Elena stood on a cliff overlooking the sea, the same sea her father had braved for a living. The wind whipped her hair, carrying the scent of salt and freedom. The vast expanse of the ocean, with its unpredictable currents and enduring strength, mirrored her own journey. She had faced a storm, navigated treacherous waters, and found her way back to shore, stronger and wiser. The waves crashed against the rocks below, a constant rhythm of power and persistence. She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, letting the sea air fill her lungs. Her spirit, unyielding, had prevailed. The silence that followed was not empty, but filled with the profound impact of her journey, a testament to the quiet strength of an ordinary woman who dared to challenge the darkness. She was free.